911 operators of Reddit, what call will you simply never forget? During a power outage, I got screamed at by a man who demanded to know why he didn't have power when a car just drove by with its lights on. Next story. An 11-year-old girl hung herself. The sound of her father calling in, bawling so hard he could barely breathe, let alone speak, and the mother's screams in the background all haunt me, 8 years later. I can't imagine surviving that. Next story. Older lady, I want to say maybe early 70s, calls in with a sort of polite urgency in her voice, tells me she thinks she's having a stroke. Tells me she has her grandchild at the house with her, asks me to call her daughter to come get the child. By the time she's done giving me the phone number, there's just a very slight slur in her speech. By the time EMS got there, probably no more than 5 minutes or so, I couldn't understand a thing she was saying. Fascinating, disturbing, and profoundly sad hearing someone stroke out on the phone as they're talking to you. Next story. Not me, but an old roommate of mine told me this story. When she was an operator about 3 years ago, a boy about 5 or 6 years old called 911 and said daddy's holding a gun to mommy's head. Through the phone, she could hear the father screaming at his wife and threatening to kill the kid. My roommate told the kid to go hide, and had to talk him through it, even when she heard gunshots. When the police and ambulances arrived, the mom had been fatally shot, but they were able to save the kid before the dad shot him. Edit, sorry I don't have any more info on the boy. I'm guessing my roommate didn't get any updates on him since she was just the 911 operator. She was actually a kinda crappy roommate and we ended on bad terms, so I can't ask her. She moved around a lot, so I don't remember where this happened, but I remember she said it was a rough area. She had a lot of intense calls. Next story. I took a call from a woman who told me her 15-year-old nephew had locked himself in the garage during a family gathering after making suicidal statements. I stayed on the line with her until my deputies could get on scene. Before they got there, however, the family was able to gain entry to the garage only to find him hanging by the neck from the garage door opener while burning to death. Apparently he had doused himself with gasoline or some sort of accelerant, lit himself on fire and then dropped with the rope. I'll never forget the screams of horror from the caller and the rest of the family in the background when they saw him, as well as the cracks in my sergeant's voice as he yelled for more units over the radio as the family started mobbing them when they arrived on scene. Next story. I've been a 911 dispatcher for 11 years in a medium-sized center, population 180,000. We have more than our share of crazy calls, but there are only a few calls that have stuck with me. For me, the ones that I can't get rid of aren't even close to being the craziest or most brutal. 7 to 8 years ago I took a 911 call from a man who came home to find his adult sister had been raped and beaten. The suspect had wrapped a telephone cord around her neck, then tried to push her through the window of the apartment. He was understandably very distraught. She was still alive and was able to talk to me. She had not been blindfolded and I was certain I could get a description of the person who had done this to her. She answered all of my other questions but absolutely refused to give me any info on the suspect. I later found out that the reason was self-preservation. The person who did it was the brother who called 911 for help. He was so believable it really messed with my head. I also felt horrible that I had continued pressing her for info with the person who hurt her was right there and that I could have potentially put her in more danger without realizing. Next story. I worked for a dispatch company very similar to Life Alert. An older lady in her 90s thought someone was intruding on her property and called the cops. She had severe dementia though and forgot she had called the cops, so when they rang her door she thought they were the intruders. So she hit her wrist button to get in contact with us. Then she got out her gun. I then called the police, while also talking to her, and literally on the recording you could hear her taking shots at the police officers on scene, while they freaked out while I got my supervisor ASAP, tried to talk her down. The police and I eventually got her to calm down and stop firing, but apparently she had missed a police officer by just 6 inches. Family had to get involved and she ended up moving to a nursing home shortly after. Dementia sucks. Next story. I'm sure plenty of other people will have crazier ones. But the first time I took an overdose call. It's a crazy experience, literally hearing someone dying on the other side of the phone. It was sort of a mix of gurgling, screaming and gasping for air. Fortunately the friend of the person that was ODing was the one who called, so I could actually get some information to pass along to my officers/firefighters. Unfortunately the caller was also super high and freaking out, understandably, and decided to lie about what drugs his friend was on, which slightly delayed Narcan being administered, not to the point that it mattered, but it did delay it. The person that OD'd lived. Next story. For me, the worst ones are always the calls you can relate to on a personal level. I took a call last month from a father who discovered his son with a bag over his head and a note next to his body. I've taken a ton of suicide calls, but this one was particularly difficult for me because the son was my age, and the way the father pleaded with his son was almost exactly the same way I've imagined my dad if I were to ever do the same. I've had the same "come on, buddy. Don't do this to me" running in my head at least 2 to 3 times a day since. Also, not technically a call but my first shift on my own, I dispatched the deputy I did my ride along with to a domestic that he ended up being shot and killed at. Hearing his blood-gurgled shots fired scream on the radio won't be something I'll ever forget. Next story. I've been doing this more than a decade and have taken some absolutely nutty calls. The one that stands out is not, but it stays with me. I took a 911 from a woman who asked me for an ambulance. Dead voice, no emotion. She could have been calling the bank for their hours. I got and confirmed her address, again, very calm. Then I asked her what was going on. In that same lifeless voice she said, "My son is dead." There was no change in her tone whatsoever. I asked her if she was sure, asked her to start CPR, which she flatly refused. I asked her, "Please, let's at least try CPR," and she said, "He is cold and dead and it's my fault. My fault. My fault." Her tone never changed. Turns out she had caught her 15-year-old son doing oxys. He puked at some point. She was totally clueless and just sent his butt to bed. Sometime during the night he either took more or what he had taken caused him to vomit again and he choked to death. I will never forget that dead tone she had, because in a way she was right, her ignorance did contribute to his death, but she is not even partially to blame. Try telling her that though. That woman will never stop hating herself. I feel for her to this day, and that was 2009-ish. Next story. Had someone call saying a man had been killed by a goat. Turns out goat is what they also call the machine that picks oranges off of trees. Miscommunication can be horrifying. Next story. Used to take ambulance calls for $999 over here in the UK and thought I'd add a more happier call here to buck the trend. I managed to deliver 5 babies while doing that job. The first one the dad was on. First thing he screams is, "The head's coming out, the head's coming out." Another one, they were on their way to hospital when the baby just started arriving, so I delivered a baby over the phone on the side of a motorway. The sound of a baby crying during childbirth is the most stress-relieving sound of all. One of the families wrote in to say thank you, and I got to meet them and the baby. On the flip side, hangings were never fun. Thankfully I only ever had 2. The first was a Tuesday morning, just started my shift at 7 a.m, first call. Woman comes on screaming this blood-curdling noise, just pure emotion. Nothing like in the films. Turns out her husband had hung himself in their bedroom with the kids still in the house. So she was trying to keep the kids out while get an ambulance. The other was a man who called ever so calmly to say his daughter had hung herself. I didn't understand why he was so calm and measured. Then he said at the end he was a police officer, so had seen this before. Poor guy. I still think about those 2 callers. Next story. A young man 23 years old called and told me he was going to commit suicide. He was my first call of my shift that day, very early in the morning. He planned to set his car on fire with himself inside. He was upset and crying, but he apologized to me. He said he was sorry I picked up the phone and he was sorry for how this was going to affect me. He hung up on me, and the second time I was speaking to him I could hear liquid splashing in the background. He ended hanging up again and I never got him back. He did end up setting me on fire and it was fully engulfed by the time anyone got there. I'll never forget his name or voice, and I simply hope I showed him kindness and compassion in his last moments.